Somewhere in a cardboard bin at the back of an Army-Navy surplus store underneath a stack of moth-eaten field jackets and unmatched combat boots, there is a leather flying jacket with a $3 price tag stapled to the collar. Nobody working the register that day knows what they're looking at. Nobody in line behind you knows either. But if you turn back the collar, and if you know exactly where to look, you'll find a stitch pattern that was never made in America. A cut that was never issued to a single United States airman. A jacket built in a factory in Germany for a man who flew missions that most of the pilots who shot at him never even knew he survived. This isn't a rare story. That's the part that should unsettle you. For decades, jackets exactly like this one passed through American surplus stores by the thousands sold for the price of a sandwich, and almost nobody stopped to ask how a piece of Luftwaffe flight equipment ended up on a rack next to decommissioned Boy Scout canteens in Ohio. The answer involves stolen leather and black markets in occupied Germany, and a government that quietly looked the other way, and millions of American soldiers who came home from the war carrying pieces of the enemy in the bottoms of their duffel bags. What you're about to learn is that almost every family in America might have once owned a piece of the Third Reich and thrown it away without knowing it. To understand how a Luftwaffe jacket ends up on a $3 rack in Ohio, you first have to understand what that jacket actually was and why a German pilot needed it to survive. By 1943, the air war over Europe was being fought at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the outside air temperature could fall to 60 degrees below zero. At that altitude, exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Fuel lines gum up, machine guns jam, and pilots sealed inside unpressurized cockpits with only a thin sheet of plexiglass between them, and the sky depended entirely on what they were wearing to keep their hands functional enough to fly the aircraft and pull the trigger. The Luftwaffe's answer was a series of fur-lined and shearling-lined leather flight jackets produced to strict military specification, stamped with acceptance marks and unit codes, and sometimes the name of the airman it was issued to stitched directly into the lining. Luftwaffe flight jackets were issued individually and tracked by unit, and were often irreplaceable if lost or damaged in combat. There wasn't just one style either, and that matters more than it might sound like at first. Fighter pilots flying short-range interceptor missions over Germany itself often wore a shorter, lighter jacket, sometimes paired with the wool Fliegerblues tunic underneath, because their sorties rarely lasted more than an hour, and they needed freedom of movement in a tight cockpit. Bomber crews and long-range fighter escorts spending 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 hours at altitude needed the heavier shearling-lined coats, the kind that could mean the difference between flying home and freezing at the controls. Each variant carried its own construction details and its own stitching patterns and its own quartermaster stamps, which is precisely why a real collector today can look at 2 jackets that seem identical to an untrained eye and tell you within a few years which unit and which climate and which stage of the war a given jacket was built for. That level of detail is also exactly what most surplus store clerks in 1965 had absolutely no reason to know. These jackets were not mass-produced the way American bomber jackets were. Germany's leather supply was strained by 1943, rationed alongside rubber and aviation fuel, and every jacket that left a Luftwaffe quartermaster's depot represented real material shortage back home. Losing one in combat, or having one stripped off a downed pilot's body, was treated by German command as more than an inconvenience. It was one more small proof that the machine keeping their air force alive was starting to come apart at the seams. And by the winter of 1944, with American and British bombers hitting German fuel and leather production simultaneously, that machine was coming apart faster than almost anyone in Berlin was willing to admit out loud. But that collapse, the one nobody could stop, is exactly what put thousands of these jackets into American hands within a matter of months. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and within days, American occupation forces were pouring into a defeated Germany, that had quite literally nowhere left to hide its military. Luftwaffe airfields across Bavaria and Saxony and the Rhineland were abandoned in place sometimes so quickly that aircraft sat with their canopies open and their pilots' personal gear still stowed in the cockpit. Storage depots that once guarded flight equipment under armed watch were now guarded by nobody at all. American GIs moving through these captured bases as part of the occupation found warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with uniforms and sidearms and medals and flags and flight jackets that no one was tracking and no one was inventorying and no one in the chaos of a collapsed government was coming back for. What happened next is one of the least discussed but most widespread phenomena of the entire post-war period: the American War Trophy economy. Officially, U.S. Army regulations allowed soldiers to bring home a limited category of war trophies, meaning non-functional or demilitarized enemy items, through a formal process that required paperwork and inspection and a customs declaration. Unofficially, that process was almost never followed to the letter. Soldiers traded cigarettes for German daggers in the ruins of Munich. They swapped rations for iron crosses in Nuremberg beer halls still standing among the rubble. And flight jackets, warm and well-made and instantly identifiable as a spoil of victory, became one of the single most sought-after souvenirs among airmen and infantry alike. Every one of those jackets had a story. Almost none of those stories made it home with them. There was also a darker, less sentimental version of this trade happening at the same time, and historians of the occupation period have documented it extensively. In a defeated Germany, where the currency was nearly worthless and basic goods were scarce, American cigarettes functioned as an unofficial second economy, and German civilians, some of them the widows or children of Luftwaffe pilots who never came home, sold whatever family possessions they had left, just to buy food on the black market. Flight jackets pulled from a downed airman's personal effects sometimes returned to a grieving family by his own squadron before the war even ended, occasionally ended up changing hands this way too, sold not by souvenir-hunting GIs, but by the families the war had already taken everything else from. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the collector catalogues, but it means some of these jackets carry a weight far heavier than leather and shearling. By the time occupation forces began rotating stateside in late 1945 and through 1946, the US military estimated that literally millions of pieces of captured German equipment had left the country in soldiers' personal baggage, far more than official trophy permits could possibly account for. Customs inspectors at East Coast ports, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of returning troops, waved through duffel bags stuffed with uniforms and medals and leather goods with barely a glance. And once those bags hit American soil, the jackets inside them stopped being war trophies. They became, in the most literal sense, just old coats. That's the moment where this story stops being about the war and starts being about what America does with things it no longer understands the value of. A returning GI who brought home a Luftwaffe flight jacket in 1946 wasn't thinking about provenance or authentication or resale value. He was thinking about getting married and finding a job and putting the war behind him as fast as possible. The jacket went into a hall closet. It got worn out hunting one winter because it was warm, and he already owned it. It got handed down to a teenage son in the 1960s who wore it to high school with no idea what it actually was. And when that son eventually cleaned out his parents' house decades later, the jacket, stiff and cracked and missing half its original fur lining, went into a box marked for donation alongside coats nobody in the family had worn in years. From there, it had exactly one place left to go. Army-Navy surplus stores exploded across the United States in the years after the war, built almost entirely on a business model nobody had ever needed before. The US government was sitting on an ocean of surplus material, and civilians wanted access to cheap, durable military-grade goods. But these stores didn't only stock official government surplus. From the very beginning, they also became informal clearinghouses for exactly the kind of unofficial war booty soldiers had brought home themselves, because store owners weren't in the business of verifying provenance. They were in the business of moving inventory. A leather jacket was a leather jacket. If it kept a customer warm and the price was right, almost nobody working the counter in 1962 or 1975 or 1988 was trained to recognize a Luftwaffe acceptance stamp hidden inside the collar, let alone treat it any differently than a jacket that had come off a decommissioning list at Fort Bragg. That single fact that nobody in the surplus supply chain was looking for German markings is the reason authenticated Luftwaffe flight jackets are almost impossible to find with a fully documented ownership history today. Militaria historians and museum curators who specialize in Luftwaffe equipment will tell you the same thing. The paper trail on these jackets doesn't run cold in the 1990s or the 1970s. It runs cold the moment the original pilot lost the jacket in 1945, because from that instant forward, the item passed hand to hand through a completely undocumented economy of trade and theft and souvenir-taking and eventually second-hand retail where nobody involved had any reason to write anything down. The jacket survived the war. What almost didn't survive was any record of where it had been. By the 1970s, a new kind of buyer started showing up in Army-Navy stores, and this is where the story takes its strangest turn. Militaria collecting was becoming a serious hobby, driven partly by Vietnam veterans developing an interest in military history, and partly by a wave of World War II documentaries and books that put German equipment back in the public imagination. These early collectors learned to do something almost nobody else did. They checked the linings, they looked for German-size stamps, and for the distinctive dark chocolate-brown dye Luftwaffe tanneries used that American leather never quite matched, and for the telltale zipper hardware stamped with German manufacturer codes instead of American ones. And when they found a real one sitting in a surplus bin, priced the same as everything else around it, they understood something the store owner didn't. They were looking at history that had been hiding in plain sight for 30 years. Early Luftwaffe Militaria collectors in the 1970s could acquire authentic flight jackets for under $10 at Army-Navy surplus stores. But that same rising market created a second problem almost immediately, and it's one that plagues the Militaria world to this day: forgery. As soon as collectors started paying real money for authenticated German flight gear, reproduction jackets began appearing aged artificially and stamped with fake acceptance marks, and sold to buyers who couldn't tell the difference between a genuine wartime survivor and a workshop recreation built to fool them. Serious appraisers today rely on a combination of forensic details to separate the real from the fake, including the specific chemical composition of period-correct dye lots and thread that matches German wartime manufacturing tolerances down to the stitch count per inch, and hardware stamped with maker's codes that can be cross-referenced against surviving Luftwaffe procurement records. In other words, the very same undocumented history that makes these jackets so valuable is also what makes them so easy to fake, and separating truth from forgery has become its own specialized field of historical detective work. The stories that came out of that first wave of collecting are the kind that sound too strange to be true, and yet historians who study the Militaria trade will confirm the pattern happened again and again across the country in different cities decades apart. A collector in Chicago finds a jacket with a name still legible in faded ink inside the collar, and years of research eventually traces it to a fighter wing that flew defense missions over the Ruhr Industrial Valley in the final year of the war. A store owner in Pennsylvania cleaning out unsold inventory before a move nearly throws out a box of what he assumes is scrap leather, until a regular customer recognizes German stitching before it hits the dumpster. A family in Texas discovers while settling an estate that the old German coat Grandpa never talked about carries a Luftwaffe eagle stamp worth more at auction than the rest of the estate combined. None of these stories were treated as remarkable at the time. That's exactly what makes them remarkable now. The equipment itself tells you why these jackets held up so well after 40 years in a closet and another 20 on a surplus rack. German military leather production, even under wartime shortages, prioritized durability, because a jacket that failed at altitude could cost a pilot his hands, or his aircraft, or his life. The shearling lining was hand-sewn in panels designed to trap body heat without adding bulk that would restrict a pilot's movement in a cramped cockpit. The exterior leather was treated to resist the extreme cold-to-warm temperature swings of a combat sortie, climbing from a warm airfield to a frozen upper atmosphere and back again within an hour. It was engineering built for survival. Nobody who built it ever imagined it would end up surviving in a bargain bin instead. What makes this story bigger than one jacket or one store or one collector's lucky find is what it reveals about how much of the 20th century's most significant material history simply disappeared through carelessness rather than destruction. Historians estimate that the overwhelming majority of unofficially souvenired German military equipment brought home by American troops was eventually lost not to fire and not to war, but to something far less dramatic. It was thrown away by people who didn't know what they were holding. Attics were cleaned out. Estate sales moved fast. Donation bins didn't ask questions. For every jacket that ended up in a museum case, historians believe dozens more ended up exactly where a coat that's outlived its usefulness always ends up: in the trash. There's one more layer to this that most people never stop to consider, and it's the part that turns a story about old coats into a story about how fragile history really is. A tank or a fighter plane or a warship gets catalogued and photographed and tracked by serial number because everyone understands from the moment it's built that it belongs to history. A jacket doesn't get that treatment. A jacket is just clothing, something a family sees every day and stops noticing entirely, right up until the person who could have explained where it came from has already passed away and taken the story with them. That's the quiet tragedy running underneath all of this. The equipment survived the war. It was the memory of where it came from that didn't. Today, an authenticated and well-provenanced Luftwaffe flight jacket can sell at specialist Militaria auction for well into the thousands of dollars, and the rarest examples, ones tied to a named pilot or a documented unit, have sold for considerably more. Museums dedicated to World War II aviation actively compete for pieces with confirmed histories because so few of them exist. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, along with regional aviation museums across Germany and the United States, hold a small number of these jackets in their collections, most acquired decades after the war from private donors who had no idea until an appraiser told them exactly what had been sitting in their closet the entire time. The gap between a $3 surplus bin and a 5-figure museum acquisition isn't really about the leather. It's about the 60 years of silence in between. That silence is the real story here more than any single jacket ever could be. It's the story of an entire generation of Americans who came home from the most destructive war in human history, carrying physical fragments of the enemy they'd defeated not as historical artifacts, but as ordinary objects to be worn and worn out and eventually discarded like anything else that gets old. It's the story of surplus stores that never set out to become accidental museums of the Third Reich's Air Force, but became exactly that anyway, one unmarked bin at a time. And it's a reminder that history doesn't always get preserved in glass cases and climate-controlled archives. Sometimes it survives by accident, folded up in the back of a closet priced at $3, waiting for someone who finally knows what they're looking at. So the next time you're digging through a bin at a surplus store or clearing out a relative's attic and you find an old leather jacket that feels heavier and better made than it has any right to be, take a second look at the stitching. Check the lining. You might be holding nothing more than a well-made old coat, Or you might be holding the last surviving piece of a story that started over a burning German airfield in 1945 and somehow against every odd made it all the way to you. If this kind of story is the one you can't stop thinking about, the untold history hiding in plain sight in ordinary places, then this channel is going to give you a lot more of them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because next time we're heading into a hangar where America did something with a captured German jet that most people have never even heard about. And the reason it stayed secret for so long is stranger than you'd expect.